So there's been a major increase in deadly bear attacks, not only within the US, but all across the globe. And this has led to a big push to ease hunting restrictions. But there is a whole lot of controversy in regards to this topic because basically you have one group that's saying, hey, there has to be a more sustainable approach to reducing deadly human and bear encounters. And of course, you have another group that says we have to hunt these bears. It's the only way. The only way to reduce these deadly bear and human encounters is to ease hunting restrictions and reduce the population. But climate change impacts key food sources for bears, such as berries, plants, and fish, because bears are omnivorous, which means they don't really consume a whole lot of red meat. And then also another perspective that you also have to consider too as well is that salmon populations have been completely decimated due to climate change and increasing water temperatures because salmon are cold-blooded and it's very difficult for them to regulate their body temperatures once they increase. And then also what comes along too with this increase in water temperature is also an increase in diseases of the salmon. So that's why we've been seeing a lot of photos of these starving bears of all species due to the fact that their resources are being decimated by unsustainable development and then of course climate change too as well. So there's an estimated 1,000 grizzlies that reside within the Yellowstone ecosystem. And this is only an increase of 136 when you compare this to the 1970s when grizzlies were first put on the Endangered Species Act. And they also say that the range of the grizzly bear and then basically all bear species have been reduced to about 97%. That's definitely a shocking statistic to know that bear range has been reduced by about 97%. And then one thing that you also have to consider too is that in the 1960s, grizzly populations in the wild were estimated to only be at about 600. So in the 1960s, there were only 600 grizzlies left in the wild. But bear populations are starting to recover and rejuvenate, especially after the predator extermination campaigns of the early 20th century. So let's go ahead and jump into some shocking statistics in regards to one of the most powerful bear species on Earth, the grizzly bear. So, standing over 8 feet tall and weighing over 800 pounds, the grizzly bear has no known enemies. However, their populations are definitely being threatened due to the fact that one of their key prey sources is being decimated, and that's what you call white bark pine tree. So basically, due to this reduction in these tree seeds, bears have been coming to lower elevations in order to look for meat. So that's one of the main reasons why we're starting to see a lot more human and bear encounters is due to the fact that these bears usually they eat a lot more plants and berries and salmon, but they've been having to come to lower elevations to look for more meat. So a grizzly bear can lift up to 500 pounds with each paw. And it's also estimated that a grizzly bear's strength is equivalent to about 5 strong human beings. And then a whole nother perspective to this situation too is that it's been all over the news. It's received a lot of attention because it's becoming a really big issue, and that's unprovoked bear attacks in Japan. So basically, there's 2 species of bear that reside in Japan, and that's the brown bear and the Asiatic bear. But bear attacks have been unlike any other year. So basically, there's been more bear attacks in 2023 than there's ever been since they've kept records. So basically, what's going on is that the acorn harvest of bears have been completely decimated due to climate change. Same thing with the grizzly bears, because a lot of these tree species are adapted to cold weather. So what's going on in Japan is that there's a less of a acorn harvest. So these bears are moving more and more into human development. And they're also facing the same controversial issue. What do we do? How do we handle this potential controversial issue? Do we ease hunting restrictions, or do we find a more sustainable approach? And one of the main arguments, too, is that a lot of these hunters and politicians that really are pushing for easing hunting restrictions say that basically the only way to solve the deadly bear attacks is to reduce the population. But there are other methods, such as wildlife corridors. So basically, there should be more corridors where bears can go safely from one habitat to another without being disturbed and without having to encroach on any human development. So there has to be more strategy in regards to these wildlife corridors. Especially what's going on with the grizzlies too is that there's not enough healthy forest where these grizzlies can reach one salmon river to another without, encroaching on some type of human development. So, definitely a very interesting situation that we have here. What do you think? Should we find a more sustainable approach? And this could possibly lead to more human and bear encounters that could be potentially deadly. Or do we just ease hunting restrictions? And a lot of states are on board with this. Louisiana and Florida have opened up black bear hunting for the first time in decades, and there's a whole lot of opposition and push against that. And then also, let's discuss one of the biggest land mammals, predatorial land mammals on the earth, and that's the polar bears. So polar bears are not adapting too well to more time on land. So basically, what's going on is that these longer summers and shorter winters are basically making it very difficult for the polar bear, to hunt its favorite prey species, which is seals. So these polar bears spend much of their time on the sea ice hunting seals. So basically, they'll catch a seal every few days. However, due to the fact that there's less sea ice, these polar bears have been having to find alternative food sources on land. And what the issue is that the food sources on land don't provide enough calories and enough fat content. So that's one of the main reasons why we've seen so many photos of these decimated polar bears, because they're not getting enough calories from the food sources on land compared to hunting and eating these very high fat content seals every few days. So definitely a fascinating perspective in regards to polar bears. And it's also estimated that their populations have been decimated by at least 38% since 1987. So it's not really looking good for these polar bears. It's a very alarming situation. And then also, just to kind of throw a whole another statistic in there too, is that by January 1st, there is a big push for a huge piece of legislation that says that they're really going to go with it. And what they want to do is that they want to take grizzly bears off the Endangered Species Act by January 1st, 2026. And this would take them off the list within the lower 48 states. And this has raised a lot of controversy, because why would you take them off the Endangered Species Act if their prey sources are becoming endangered? Salmon populations, especially in the Pacific Northwest, are being decimated, and they're dying off in large numbers due to the heat stress. And a lot of people are unaware of this. And not only is the salmon populations being decimated, but also, like I said, the sources of food, especially from tree species and plant species that are more adapted to cold weather, you know, it's a very alarming situation. But it's like, what do we do? There has to be a more sustainable method to reduce these interactions. And I think the best way to go about this is developing more strategic wildlife corridors or areas like maps and different trails and pathways where these bears can get to undisturbed forest and healthy forest from one habitat to another without disturbing human development. So it's going to be very interesting. And even a lot of the wildlife corridors that have recently been built, especially in California, definitely think they're lackluster in regards to their strategy, as far as moving them from one healthy habitat to another. Because what's going on is that these bear species and even all of the apex predators are, they say that there's a good chance that they can become extinct. So it's not only the bear. And then, the bear, just to kind of compare it to all the other apex predators, they say the bear is the smartest and most intelligent land mammal in North America. And they also have one of the biggest brains of any predator in the world. And a lot of biologists say that bear intelligence and the intelligence of great apes are comparable, or even some biologists say that the bear deserves the crown in the animal kingdom for having the most brain power. So there are some biologists that say that the bear is the smartest animal in the world. But definitely a very interesting situation. I also wanted to throw on top of all of this too is that when we have longer summers and shorter winters, it also reduces the amount of time that bears have to hibernate. So we're also dealing with a lot more hungry bears that are reducing their hibernation time too as well. So this is one of the main reasons why it's been all over the news, why there's been a lot more bear activity, because not only are their food sources being disturbed, but also their hibernation patterns are becoming shorter and shorter too as well. So what a fascinating, controversial topic that needs a lot more attention. But we talk about these things at Twilight Mysteries. We're rough riders, we're not afraid to really get into these issues that matter the most and deserves the most attention. So what do you guys think? Should there be a more sustainable approach to reducing these deadly bear encounters with humans, or should we just hunt them down? So would love to know your opinion. But thank you so much for listening to the one and only Twilight Mysteries. Here, I can guarantee you, we talk about stuff that you won't find anywhere else. But thank you.